Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going, well, I guess you could say we're going a little dark.
Oh,
Yeah, we're talking about what causes democracies to break down.
interesting. You know, you'd think. I mean, you'd think we'd be focusing on all the successes.
Yeah. But sometimes looking at the failures, why, that's how we learn the most.
You got that right.
Ah.
That's that old saying, right? Learn from your mistake.
Exactly, and that's actually kind of the whole idea behind the book we're looking at today, When Democracy Breaks. So, this book, it was written by a bunch of historians and political scientists, and instead of focusing on, how democracies work when they're successful, it looks at 11 different historical examples of democracies that, well, that went very wrong.
Wow, 11. That's quite a range, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, I mean, they cover everything from ancient Athens.
Oh, wow. Ancient Athens. So, like, the birthplace of democracy.
Yeah, all the way to modern-day Venezuela.
Wow. That really makes you wonder, huh? Like, are there common threads, that kind of transcend time and culture when it comes to these breakdowns?
Well, that is exactly what we're here to figure out. But before we dive into, all these historical train wrecks, maybe we should take a step back and clarify something really basic.
Okay, sure.
What do we even mean by democracy and for Kane, and what does it mean for a democracy to break down? Because, to be honest, there isn't one single definition that everyone agrees on.
Right. And plus, even how we define democracy, that has evolved over time too, hasn't it?
For sure. When democracy breaks actually takes a pretty broad approach, highlighting two main elements.
Okay.
Majority rule, of course,
Yeah.
but also the protection of dissent and opposition. Both of those things have to exist together.
We got to go hand in hand. That's interesting, though, because some of the examples in the book, like ancient Athens or the U.S. before the Civil War, those wouldn't exactly be considered full democracies,
Oh, yeah.
by today's standards. Nope. Definitely not. Especially when you think about it, back then, only a very limited group of people could actually vote.
Exactly. But you know what? That's actually why I think these cases are so interesting.
Yeah.
They show us those early attempts to balance the power of the majority with the rights of the minority.
Yeah.
And they show us, without that balance, things can go really wrong, even in systems that look pretty democratic on the surface.
So, just to clarify, even if a system starts out allowing dissent, but then starts cracking down on anyone who disagrees with whoever's in power, that's a bad sign.
Oh, yeah. Big time. I mean, you can't just hold elections and call it a day. You have to protect the mechanisms,
Right.
all the stuff that allows for real opposition and debate and criticism. If you lose that, it's only a matter of time before the whole thing crumbles.
Okay. So the book talks about some common factors, the kind of things that tend to show up whenever democracies get into trouble. Some of them might sound kind of familiar, e-trick, like a bad economy, or inequality, and of course, we got to mention political polarization, right? All the hot topics. What's interesting, though, it's almost never just one of those things by itself. It's more like, all these things kind of come together like a perfect storm, all pew, and they create this super unstable situation.
So it's not just a checklist?
Not really. It's more like a web of pressure,
Yeah.
while pushing and pulling on the system, and eventually it just can't take it anymore.
Okay. Now, there's also this idea that the book emphasizes democratic sentiment. It's this idea that people, especially the leaders, need to really believe in the democratic system even when they don't get their way.
This is a good one. Because what's so fascinating about democratic sentiment is how easily it can disappear, how it can just erode away bit by bit. Like it's like that story about boiling a frog, right? If you turn up the heat slowly enough, the frog doesn't even realize it's in danger until it's too late.
Okay, that's a little creepy, but I think I see where you're going with this. So if people start getting too comfortable with politicians bending the rules, even in small ways, that could be a sign that something bigger is wrong.
Exactly. It's that acceptance, that creeping acceptance of undemocratic behavior.
Right.
That's what really sets the stage for a total collapse.
Yikes.
Yeah.
So, like those little cracks in a foundation, if you ignore them long enough, eventually the whole house comes crumbling down.
Perfect analogy.
Okay, enough doom and gloom for now.
Right.
Let's get into some real examples. Let's start with ancient Athens. You've got this Reuis, this thriving democracy. Athens is this powerful city-state on the rise, and then bam, things start going south, literally, with that disastrous military expedition to Sicily.
Ah, yes. The Sicilian expedition. This is where things get really juicy.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just some, random military blunder. It revealed a big problem with Athenian democracy itself.
Yeah, it's just they kind of overestimated themselves, huh? Too used to winning. Maybe they forgot how to lose.
Yeah, maybe. But there's more to it than that. Their system of direct democracy where every citizen got to vote on everything. Wow, that made them vulnerable to these rash decisions. Especially when you had powerful people, stirring up the crowds.
So, wait, even in ancient Athens, where everyone supposedly had a say, there was still this elite group calling the shots.
Well, absolutely. Athenian democracy was this.
Okay.
It was this weird mix of direct participation and powerful elites. And let me tell you, those elites, they often had their own agendas. And when those interests clashed with what the majority wanted, well, let's just say the system didn't handle it very well.
And in the case of the Sicilian expedition, they basically gambled big. And they lost.
Big time.
Yeah, and the consequences were, well, they were devastating.
Absolutely.
Not just for their military, but for their whole political system, too.
It's a classic example of how even a system designed to give everyone a voice can be manipulated by those who know how to use power and influence. And when those individuals, when they put their own ambitions above the good of everyone else, it can spell disaster.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit, jump across the world, to another experiment in democracy. The United States. Before the Civil War, it's the 1850s. Tensions are high over slavery and the political system. It's starting to show some cracks.
This is a good one. What's really striking about this case is how the South's defense of slavery, it actually led to a systematic effort to shut down free speech.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Any criticism of slavery, even if it was just about the economics of it, it was met with fierce resistance.
Wow. So it's like they were trying to shut down any conversation at all that even hinted at changing the system.
Exactly. They saw any critique of slavery as this threat to their entire way of life, economically, socially, and they were willing to use any means necessary to silence those voices.
I remember reading about that guy, Hinton Helper. He wrote this whole book arguing that slavery was actually bad for the South economically.
Oh, yeah. The Impending Crisis. That's what it was called.
Yeah, that's it. Can you imagine the reaction back then?
Oh, it was huge. His book was banned all across the South. People were burning copies of it in the streets.
Yeah.
And Helper himself, he had to run for his life.
Wow. It wasn't just about disagreeing. It was about making sure that no one at all, could even question their worldview.
Exactly. They couldn't allow even the smallest challenge to their narrative. It was like an existential threat to them. And they responded with violence and intimidation to maintain control.
Which, of course, is the exact opposite of how a healthy democracy works.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's a classic example of how fear and intolerance, they can lead to the suppression of any dissent, even in a system that supposedly values free speech.
Right.
And once that starts, it's hard to stop.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit and head over to 1930s Japan. You've got this Milan, this new constitutional monarchy. Democracy is expanding, but under the surface, there's this rising tide of militarism and nationalism.
Ah, Japan. Such a fascinating case. What's so interesting about this period is how you have this blend. You have these traditional power structures like the military and the emperor, and they're trying to coexist with these new political parties. And it's not exactly going smoothly.
It's like they were trying to force democracy onto a system that just wasn't built for it.
Yeah. Trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have this major event, the Manchurian incident in 1931. This is where the military basically just goes rogue and invades Manchuria without even asking the government.
Oh, yeah, the Manchurian incident. That was a game changer.
I mean, the military just decides to start a war on their own.
It was a huge power grab.
Yeah.
And it allowed the military to exploit all these nationalist feelings to create this fear of outside threats. And they used that to silence any opposition and basically solidify their own power.
So they used propaganda and this fake crisis to justify cracking down on anyone who disagreed with them. And eventually, they dismantled democratic institutions altogether.
It's a perfect example of how external threats, whether they're real or not, can be used to undermine democracy and justify authoritarian measures.
And it all happened with the support, or at least the silence, of the people who were supposed to be protected by those very institutions.
It's really something, isn't it?
It is. From this hopeful democracy to a militarized state, almost overnight.
It shows how fragile those democratic institutions can be, especially when you have a powerful group that's determined to take over, and they're just waiting for the right opportunity.
Okay. Next up is a case that might surprise some people. Czechoslovakia, after World War II, the Soviets liberate them. There is a strong communist party. But here's the thing. A lot of non-communist Czech intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
they were actually pretty open to this idea of a people's democracy led by the communists.
That is interesting.
So,
They basically bought into the communist propaganda.
well, it's a little more complicated than that.
Okay.
You got to remember, this was right after World War II. People were still traumatized by fascism, and the Soviet Union had played a huge role in defeating the Nazis.
Oh, I see.
So they were seen as heroes, right? Bringing this new system, this more just system, to replace the old one that had failed so miserably.
Okay, so the communists basically used that to their advantage.
Exactly. They were really good at presenting their ideology as this,
Yeah.
this more fair and equitable alternative to Western democracy, which they made look pretty bad, by the way.
And these intellectuals, they really fell for it.
Well, the book calls it a belief in this new faith of socialism, and it blinded them to the dangers of what was really just, communist authoritarianism in disguise.
Wow. It's amazing how good intentions can be used to pave the way for something so awful.
It is, isn't it? And it makes you think, how
Yeah.
often does that happen? People get drawn in by these promises of a better future, and then they don't see the warning signs until it's too late.
And by then,
Yeah.
it's usually too late to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. Like, in the case of Czechoslovakia, the boiling water, that was the slow erosion of democracy, all under the cover of creating a more just society.
And by the time people realized what was really going on,
Yeah,
the communists had already taken complete control.
it's a chilling thought. Okay, let's move on to a case that's often used as a warning. Chile in the early 1970s, they elect this socialist president, Salvador Allende, but the country is deeply divided, and then boom, a military coup overthrows the government, and a brutal dictatorship takes over.
Chile. Oh boy. That one's a tough one. I think to really understand Chile, you have to understand the role of political violence, especially in the years leading up to the coup.
So it was a pretty volatile situation.
It was like the whole country was ready to explode. And then you have the U.S. getting involved, which, let's be honest, they weren't exactly fans of Allende's socialist policies.
No, they definitely weren't.
The U.S. definitely played a role.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to remember, the problems that led to Chile's breakdown, those started internally.
So it was more than just outside forces interfering.
Way more. The
Yeah.
violence,
Mm-hmm.
it created this self-fulfilling prophecy where people on both sides started abandoning democracy because they thought it was the only way to survive.
So it's like the violence itself became the excuse for the coup. The military could just step in and say, look at this chaos. We're the only ones who can fix this.
Exactly. They took advantage of the fear and instability.
And promised to bring back order.
Yeah.
Mm.
But what they brought was a brutal dictatorship
Mm-hmm.
that lasted for years.
It's crazy how quickly things can change, how fragile democracy really is when you have people who are willing to use violence and fear to get what they want.
And it also shows how dangerous it is to be complacent. When people don't speak up against those early violations of democratic norms, they risk creating this slippery slope that leads to even worse abuses.
Okay, last stop on our historical tour of democratic disasters. Russia in the 1990s. This brand new democracy
Right.
rises from the ashes of the Soviet Union. But it doesn't last long. Then comes Vladimir Putin, this former KGB agent who promises to restore order and stability.
Ah, Putin. Now, what's really interesting about Russia is that their democracy didn't collapse in some big dramatic event, like a coup or a revolution.
So that isn't a sudden thing?
No, it was much slower, more like a disease slowly spreading through the body.
So instead of storming the palace, Putin basically just chipped away at it from the inside.
Exactly. He got rid of anyone who challenged him, took control of the media, and silenced any critics.
And he did all that while pretending to be a democratically elected leader.
He was a master at that, holding these fake elections, allowing just enough dissent to make it look real, but never enough to actually threaten his power.
It's amazing how many people bought it.
A lot of Russians were tired of the chaos and uncertainty of the 90s, so they were willing to trade their freedom for some stability, even if it meant living under an authoritarian regime.
That's pretty depressing.
It is, but it reminds us that democracy is precious, and it requires us to constantly protect it, both citizens and leaders.
Okay, that was quite a journey. And I have to say, it's a little unsettling to see some of those same patterns popping up in different parts of the world today.
It is concerning,
Yeah.
but it's also a chance to learn from the past and to be more vigilant about protecting the democracies we have now.
You're right. Stay tuned. Because when we come back, we'll be digging deeper into more examples and exploring what we can all do to safeguard democratic values, both at home and around the world. Wow, those were some pretty heavy examples of, well, democracy is not exactly working out so well.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, for sure.
It is, but I keep thinking back to what you said earlier. Understanding where things went wrong in the past, that can help us protect what we have now.
You got it. It's not about dwelling on the negative, right? It's about using those lessons to be more aware, more proactive, you
Yeah.
know, like really stand up for those democratic values.
And speaking of historical lessons, the authors of When Democracy Breaks, they don't stop there. They take us to another case study, Venezuela.
Ah, Venezuela. Now, this one's particularly interesting.
Yeah, because for a while there, they were actually considered a relatively stable democracy. Until the late 20th century, things were, well, they were pretty good. But then along comes Hugo Chavez, this charismatic leader bursting onto the scene, promising this Bolivarian revolution.
And this is where things take a turn.
Hmm.
Chavez's approach was different from a lot of the cases we've looked at so far. He didn't, stage a dramatic coup or just rely on brute force.
Right, it wasn't this sudden takeover.
No, no. It was much more subtle, almost insidious, you could say.
It's like he played the long game, right? Slowly chipping away at democratic institutions, all under the guise of helping the people.
Exactly. He would win an election, make some popular policy changes, and then use that momentum to consolidate power and limit any challenges down the line. Stack the courts with loyalists, take control of the media, gradually centralize power.
All while keeping up this image of being this champion of the people.
Oh, he was a master of that.
Yeah.
He used this left-wing populist rhetoric that really resonated with the working class, the people who felt ignored by the system.
So it wasn't just about raw power, it was about controlling the narrative, right? Shaping how people saw the situation, how they saw him.
Precisely. He painted his opponents as these out-of-touch elites who didn't care about the needs of ordinary people.
And it worked, didn't it? I mean, he was incredibly popular for a long time.
He was. It allowed him to justify his actions, no matter how authoritarian they became, as necessary to protect the revolution, to fight for the people against those who would exploit them.
But those actions, that erosion of democratic checks and balances, it had devastating consequences in the long run. When Chavez died, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a system that was basically primed for authoritarian rule.
It's almost as if Chavez laid the groundwork for a dictatorship, carefully and deliberately, and Maduro simply stepped into the role that had been created for him.
And the really tragic part is that many Venezuelans initially supported Chavez's policies. They genuinely believed he was fighting for them, that he would improve their lives.
They didn't realize he was dismantling the very institutions that were meant to protect their rights and freedoms.
Yeah, they were focused on the short-term gains, not realizing the long-term damage that was being done.
It's a classic example of how good intentions can be twisted and manipulated to serve an authoritarian agenda.
So we've seen how a leader with a populist message and a charismatic personality can dismantle a democracy from within. But when democracy breaks, it also looks at cases where the threat comes from a different angle. A seemingly moderate party that gradually becomes more authoritarian.
And for that example, they take us to Turkey.
Okay, Turkey.
Yeah.
Now, early 21st century Turkey, that was a time of a lot of optimism, right? They had this newly elected party, the AKP, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who initially seemed pretty moderate, pretty reformist.
There was a lot of hope, both inside and outside Turkey, that the AKP would bring about genuine democratic reforms. People were talking about improving human rights, maybe even joining the European Union.
It seemed like they were on the right track, at least for a while. They made some positive changes early on.
But then, almost imperceptibly, things started to shift.
Like that frog in the boiling water again, right?
Exactly. Gradual changes, incremental steps that were easy to overlook until it was too late.
So how did it happen? What were the warning signs that things were going in the wrong direction?
Well, it started with subtle shifts in rhetoric. They began demonizing their opponents, calling them enemies of the state, threats to national security.
Creating that us versus them dynamic.
Exactly. Then they started cracking down on the media, censoring critical voices, arresting journalists, using this very broad definition of terrorism to silence anyone who disagreed with them.
They basically made it dangerous to criticize the government.
They created a climate of fear where anyone who dared to question their actions risked being labeled a traitor or a terrorist.
So they were very strategic in how they consolidated their power, weren't they? Appealing to religious and nationalist sentiments, positioning themselves as the defenders of true Turkish values.
It was very clever, very effective. They exploited those existing societal tensions to their advantage.
So what started as this hopeful experiment in democratic pluralism, it gradually morphed into something far more authoritarian.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. It shows how even a party that starts out seeming moderate, operating within a democratic system, can gradually erode those very foundations and become something far more sinister.
And it happens so slowly, so subtly that it can be hard to recognize until it's gone too far.
That's the danger, isn't it? We tend to think of democracy as this static thing, something that's either there or not. But it's a process, a constant struggle to maintain those checks and balances, to protect those fundamental freedoms.
So, what can we learn from all this? How do we guard against this kind of slow, insidious erosion of democratic values? I mean, these examples, they're pretty unsettling.
They are, but they also offer valuable lessons. And that's what we'll dig into after a quick break. We'll connect these historical cases to our current situation and explore some practical steps we can all take to be more vigilant, more proactive in defending democracy, both here at home and around the world.
All right, so we've looked at some pretty, I don't know, some pretty intense examples of how democracies can just fall apart.
Yeah.
And it can be from inside or outside pressures. But I'm really hoping we can move on now and focus on solutions because I got to say, I'm feeling a little, well, a little anxious after all that history.
I hear you. It can be pretty overwhelming to see these patterns, these patterns just repeating themselves over and over again. But we can't forget, we're not just watching this happen. We have a voice, we can make a difference, and we can use that to protect those values, those institutions that are so important for a democracy to actually work.
So where do we even start? The authors of When Democracy Breaks, they do offer some advice, right?
They do. And one of the biggest red flags they point to is this gradual erosion of democratic norms and values. It's not usually this big dramatic collapse. It's more like a slow decline. They chip away at the foundation until the whole thing is weak.
Like one of those old houses with a bad foundation. You might not see the cracks at first, but then the whole thing starts to lean. And if you don't fix it, well, you know what happens.
Exactly. And in a democracy, those cracks can be all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Attacks on the courts, trying to silence the press, messing with elections, and they always try to make it sound like they're doing it for the greater good, like there's some big crisis, and they have to do these extreme things.
So how do we see those warning signs before it's too late? It's easy to get swept up in all the talk, especially when it's coming from people you trust or from sources that seem legit.
You got to think critically, be skeptical, question what you hear, and don't just take things at face value. Look deeper. Like, if someone's saying certain groups are the enemy, or that a certain news outlet is lying, or that the only way to save the country is to take away some freedoms, that's when you got to pay attention.
It's about recognize those tactics, right? Those ways they try to divide us to create an us versus them situation, which is the opposite of what a diverse society needs.
Exactly. A healthy democracy, it needs debate. It needs people to share their ideas, even if those ideas are difficult or make people uncomfortable. When you start silencing people, when you start saying anyone who disagrees with you is bad, you're heading down a dangerous path.
The book also talks about how extremist groups can really mess things up. They polarize society, they make people lose trust in democratic institutions. And it's not just a left or right thing either. Extremism, it can come from anywhere.
It can, and it does. What all these extremist groups have in common is that they use fear and anger to manipulate people. They exploit whatever divisions already exist. They want to make you believe that they're the only ones who can save you from some big threat.
And with social media these days, those messages spread so fast. It's hard to know what's true and what's not, what's a real problem and what's just, people trying to stir up trouble.
That's why you got to be careful about what you believe. Don't just accept everything you see online. Check where the information's coming from, look at different viewpoints, and be careful about anyone who claims to have all the answers.
Okay, so critical thinking, checking sources, watching out for those divisive tactics, got it. But what about actually doing something? I mean, what can one person really do? It feels like such a huge problem.
Don't underestimate the power of individual action. It might seem small, but when lots of people do it, it can have a huge impact. Like, think about a single raindrop. By itself, it doesn't do much. But when you have millions of raindrops, you get a powerful river.
Okay, I like that. So what are some of those raindrops we can contribute?
Well, supporting organizations that are fighting for democratic values, that's a big one. Whether it's groups that help people register to vote, or monitor elections, or advocate for free speech and a free press.
So putting our money where our mouth is. And our time, too, I'd imagine.
Exactly. Volunteering, donating, even just talking about these issues with other people, they can make a difference.
What about actually talking to people who disagree with us politically? It feels like these days everyone's just stuck in their own bubble, their own echo chamber. It's almost impossible to have a normal conversation about politics without it turning into an argument.
It's tough, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But I think it's more important now than ever to break out of those bubbles and have respectful conversations with people who see things differently. It's not about changing anyone's mind. It's about understanding, building connections, finding that common ground.
That sounds good, but let's be real. Some people are so stubborn, I just don't see how talking is going to do much.
You're right. It's not always going to be easy, and it's not always going to work. But even if you can get someone to question what they believe, to maybe see things from a different angle, or even just show them that you can disagree without being angry and mean, that's a step in the right direction.
And of course, one of the most important things we can do in a democracy is vote.
Absolutely. Voting is the foundation, but it's just the beginning. We got to stay informed, get involved in the issues, and hold our leaders accountable.
Be active participants, not just passive bystanders.
You got it. Democracy is not something you just watch. It's something you got to work at, something you got to protect.
I'm feeling a bit more optimistic now. It's easy to get discouraged when you see all the problems facing democracies, but it really comes down to each of us doing what we can.
It's a team effort, and every little thing we do adds up. We have to remember that democracy isn't a finish line. It's a journey. And it's a journey that needs us to be vigilant, to stay engaged, and to really commit to those values that make a society free and just.
That's a great way to put it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into when democracy breaks. It's been a real eye-opener and a really important conversation to have.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the future of democracy, it really is up to all of us.
And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. What can you do in your own life to be a better defender of democracy? Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and thanks for listening.